Once the dragon ruled unchallenged, but even jade can shatter. Here's the story of the greatest dynasty you've never heard of, the Qing, and the turning point when it all began to fall apart. In the Forbidden City, a young man crapped his pants. It wasn't his fault. He was just hungry. The year before, he'd watched his father die of starvation right in the palace gardens. Now, despite being an heir to the throne, he was down to one thin blanket, forcing him to huddle for warmth and comfort. This wasn't some Dickensian London slum, but the imperial palace of Beijing, seat of the great Qing Dynasty. What happened here would change China and the world forever. Here's the problem. Everyone knows about the Romans, Greeks, and Mongols, but almost no one knows about the Qing. Why? Well, their story is more complicated than most. For starters, they weren't even Chinese. They were a nomadic tribe from this place. Wait, what? Yeah. To understand why they became the last imperial dynasty to rule over China, we have to start at the beginning. Around 1644, the land that would become China was a patchwork quilt of different states and empires. In the middle was the Ming Dynasty, but around it were various nomadic groups, like the Manchurians. When the Manchurians founded the Qing Dynasty, they started as a small state, forcing them to forge alliances with other tribes to survive. They also cleverly used the Chinese system against the Chinese, which allowed them to expand quickly. By 1680, they controlled everything. This included Taiwan, Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. And they kept going until they reached the mountains of the Caucasus. That's right. Their empire stretched from Ireland to Japan. It was a feat unmatched in Chinese history. But wait a minute. Didn't everyone hate each other? Well, sort of. The Qing had conquered the Ming and many other dynasties before them. But ruling such a diverse and huge empire required some serious skills. Surprisingly, the Qing learned these skills quickly, allowing them to bring unprecedented peace and prosperity to China. Over the next century, life got better for most people, thanks to lower taxes, less warfare, and more farming. So much so that China's population doubled, tripled, then doubled again. And where there are lots of people, there's lots of money. The Qing took advantage of this by building infrastructure, including a road system that would make any modern country jealous. In fact, the last emperor commuted to work by car, something that took him 2 hours through traffic. Imagine that. The arts flourished during the Qing, with painters and potters working at the height of their craft. Even today, their blue and white porcelain is sold for millions of dollars. It was also a golden age for China's literati class, who wrote poetry and novels that are still read today. The Qing emperors also made sure that their glory was known across Asia. They built palaces everywhere, even here in Mongolia, where Genghis Khan once lived. As a result, the Qing emperors saw themselves as the new Genghis Khans, bringing order to the lands of the old Mongols. In fact, the last emperor had a different name for himself. He called himself the Two-in-One Emperor. Get it? Two different types of ruler. By now, it might seem like the Qing dynasty could rule forever, but if you thought that, you'd be wrong. Because though the Qing seemed strong, cracks were forming beneath the silk, and the dynasty wouldn't last another century. So here's the big question. Why did the Qing fall? Well, you can blame one event for most of their problems: the First Opium War in 1839. Basically, China was selling lots of cheap goods to the West, but the British weren't playing fair, dumping their own cheap goods in China and only accepting silver for them. So to protect local businesses, the Chinese government passed laws banning Western imports. Not smart, because that Western trade was the only source of silver. Without that revenue, the Chinese government couldn't pay its army or officials. So to solve this problem, they created a state monopoly to sell opium, which led to widespread addiction and social unrest. When the British found out, they sent in the Royal Navy to teach the Chinese a lesson they wouldn't forget. The Chinese lost badly, giving up huge parts of their empire and having to pay millions in reparations. But this was just the start. Every year, Western powers would find new excuses to meddle in Chinese affairs. At its worst, China was occupied by 8 different foreign armies. Meanwhile, China's population was growing so fast that there simply weren't enough jobs. So some young men joined secret societies, fighting against both the Qing government and the Western powers. The biggest of these rebellions was the Taiping Rebellion in 1850. At its peak, 20 million Chinese soldiers fought in this civil war, making it the bloodiest in history. Despite the Qing winning, it left them bankrupt, opening up more opportunities for the Western powers to take advantage. So far, the Qing government hasn't really been in the spotlight, but don't worry, they'll soon have a starring role. See, while the Qing emperors knew their empire was losing strength, they refused to do anything about it. You see, the emperor gets his power from the mandate of heaven, which gives him absolute power, but only if he does his job well. If he doesn't, then heaven will revoke his mandate and give it to someone else. This is why the Qing emperors always isolated themselves from the outside world, literally and figuratively, refusing to leave the Forbidden City and never meeting any foreigners. To them, the world outside the palace walls was dangerous and unpredictable. So instead, they clung to tradition, wasting their time collecting more concubines, while millions of their subjects suffered and died. It got so bad that the leader of Britain and China commented that the Qing emperors were like overgrown eunuchs, interested in nothing but sex and food. Though admittedly, he probably could have chosen better examples. The only person who tried to break this cycle was Xianfeng's wife, the Empress of the Two Palaces, who successfully advised her husband to move the capital to a more defensible city, Beijing. But she paid the ultimate price for this, angering the superstitious Xianfeng, who had her put to death for bringing bad luck. With all this chaos going on, it's no wonder that more rebellions broke out, including the infamous Boxer Rebellion in 1900, which ended in a humiliating defeat for the Qing and the Chinese people. The Boxers were a secret society of martial artists who wanted to drive all foreigners out of China. At first, the Qing government supported them because they, too, hated foreigners. But when the Boxers attacked foreigners in Beijing, 8 different nations formed an alliance to put them down. This humiliation showed the Qing government just how weak they'd become. And for the first time, the idea of a Chinese revolution started to take hold. But who was behind this? Well, that brings us back to our young boy who pooped his pants. His name was Guangxu, and after his father died, he inherited the throne, becoming the last emperor of China. Unlike his predecessors, he wanted to modernize the army and the government. But he couldn't do that without the help of one very powerful woman, his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi. She helped him issue decrees that reformed the civil service exams and increased industrial production. But she was really just buying time, waiting for the perfect moment to seize power for herself. And that moment came when Guangxu suddenly died, likely of stomach cancer, leaving the way open for her to declare herself Empress Dowager and effectively take control of the entire empire. You'd think she'd be happy now, but she wasn't. She spent her time crushing rebels and anyone who threatened her power. In fact, she delayed China's modernization for years, eventually starting her own conservative movement, called the Self-Strengthening Movement. But it was too late. China had already lost its chance to become a modern state, and the Qing Dynasty was already doomed. And to find out how, why not watch our video on the collapse of the Qing Dynasty? And if you want to know more about ancient China, stay tuned. The final act was swift. Reformers who advocated for a constitutional monarchy were imprisoned or killed. Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary who studied abroad, fled to Hawaii, where he plotted with other revolutionaries to return to China and overthrow the Qing Dynasty. Finally, in 1911, they had their chance. An explosion in a Shanghai munitions factory gave them the excuse they needed to start a rebellion. Though caught off guard, the Qing forces couldn't stop them. Soon, entire provinces were declaring themselves independent republics. And on February 12, 1912, Sun Yat-sen arrived in Beijing to find the Forbidden City empty. The Qing court had fled south, ending their 2,000-year run. The last emperor, Puyi, was just 5 years old when he took the throne. After he abdicated, he was given a noble title and a pension, which he enjoyed until World War II, when the Japanese captured him and forced him to declare himself the puppet emperor of their occupied empire. After the war, he lived a quiet life until his death in 1967. As you can imagine, there's a lot more to the story. For instance, how did the Qing go from being a minor power to ruling all of China? Or how did they survive the Opium Wars? Or how did they lose the support of their own people? These are all great questions, but sadly, we're running out of time. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment. Once the dragon ruled unchallenged, but even jade can shatter. Here's the story of the greatest dynasty you've never heard of, the Qing, and the turning point when it all began to fall apart.